On the evening of the Iowa caucus, as Clinton and Sanders battled to win over caucus goers in a state which is over 90% white and mostly liberal, I sat down with Todd Shaw, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at the University of South Carolina, to talk about the challenges Sanders' campaign has to overcome in order to connect with African American voters and why South Carolina's First in the South primary will likely make or break Sanders' run for the White House. Professor Shaw, thanks for taking the time to sit down with me today.
I'm glad to be here with you.
Wanted to ask you a couple of questions. Tonight is the Iowa caucus, and in a few hours we will know, it's on the Democratic side as well as the Republican side, which candidate will get the first win on both parties. Specifically wanted to talk to you about Bernie Sanders. What are some of the benefits of Iowa that Sanders will see, as well as some of the challenges?
Well, there's a lot of discussion at times about how Iowa, with its interesting or kooky caucus system, is not, sort of representative of the types of primaries or primary systems you'll see throughout most of the country. But Iowa sets the tone in some respects. It can be a place for a candidate like Sanders, who's an outsider, that it can give him a bump and some degree of notoriety, certainly more media and more donor coverage, or more donors attracted to him. Similar to what it might have done and did do for Barack Obama in 2008. So Iowa can give a bit of a springboard. Of course, you have all those other primaries and caucuses, but Iowa may help set a tone for Sanders and help him, state in fact that he is the challenger and the credible challenger to Hillary Clinton.
Okay. Now, Iowa and New Hampshire are, as far as voter demographics, because New Hampshire's next week, are they going to be about the same type of demographics?
Yes, predominantly white and nearly overwhelmingly white in that respect.
Okay. Now, the news reports and social media and every online news outlet says that New Hampshire and Iowa are full of liberals. What type of liberal or what type of voter is Bernie Sanders' ideal voter?
Well, Bernie Sanders would say that any voter who's willing to vote for him is an ideal voter. But I think the Sanders coalition, sort of it stands now, includes young people. It includes what you might say are individuals who are a bit disenchanted with the establishment. I would say that there's sort of an interesting collection of Americans, from everyone who might have supported the Occupy movement to, against Wall Street, and of course the ways in which Sanders, sort of righteously rails against Wall Street, to individuals who would see themselves as a little bit from the Tea Party. So but I suspect that the wide swath of folk really are sort of that liberal coalition, a younger coalition, some older, and those and new voters in some respects. That he'll be bringing in folk who might have said, I've stepped out of the process, or I haven't voted in quite a while. So that seems to be parts of his coalition thus far.
Okay. Now, in February, the 27th, will be the First in the South primary. South Carolina has that covenant spot.
Right.
What are the challenges that Sanders' campaign will face in South Carolina?
So Sanders quite rightly talks about the ways in which he has sort of civil rights bona fides, the ways in which he tries not to make it sound too atypical or stereotypical to say, I marched with King. Although there's some evidence he certainly was involved in the civil rights movement. But he's, for these many years, has represented a state and been a politician in the state that's 95% white. So now he's coming to South Carolina running against someone. There's very few folk in the African American community, outside the African American community, like Hillary Clinton, who would have the name recognition that she does. African Americans, if we think back to 2008 in South Carolina, there was somewhat of a divide many months before the primary, in that it wasn't a foregone conclusion that Barack Obama was going to win the South Carolina primary and win it fairly solidly. The ways in which Bernie Sanders has to convince African American voters that he's the safe bet or he's the good bet. There are some folk who may still think about what occurred in that 2008 campaign. It wasn't Hillary's words, but it really was Bill Clinton's words that set a certain political tone. When Obama won, and he said in effect, well, Jesse Jackson won South Carolina. Well, that didn't quite, that didn't quite set the, or make some people happy about that. So, even given that, Hillary Clinton is still very popular. She's very popular among elected officials and among sort of civic leaders in African American communities. So Sanders has the challenge of challenging that popularity, but also saying, I'm going to mobilize in new ways and mobilize new voters because it's not a foregone conclusion that Clinton is going to mobilize the base in quite the same way as Obama did. And I would suspect she has that challenge.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of elected officials have been saying that Sanders' platform and the issues he seems to care about are most relevant to African Americans. But on the same hand, most elected officials in South Carolina have endorsed Clinton.
Right.
Do you think that Sanders is making that case with the African American community? And if so, how well is he doing?
I think Sanders has fine-tuned a bit more. You won't get African Americans, so African Americans politically and economically, for the most part, when we think about it in American politics, are fairly liberal. And so when you ask questions about, when you say that you want to, when he uses his pet phrase about, billionaires have run the country too much, we really do have to have a fair shot for the rest of us. African American audiences aren't going to disagree with you too much on that. A community aware of economic inequality is not going to disagree. Or that there should be, greater employment opportunities, greater opportunities in terms of a fair wage, a $15 an hour wage. Again, African Americans are not going to disagree. I think there's a pragmatism, however, in the African American community that says, can you win? In fact, this was the same pragmatism that Barack Obama faced. Iowa convinced African American voters that maybe, in fact, yes, white voters will vote for Barack Obama. So it isn't a protest campaign. It is a campaign that has real legs. And so I think that there's in an interesting way, that's the same challenge that Sanders has. We like your ideas. We like the ways in which you're talking about fundamental fairness. Can you actually win? Can you actually create a coalition to win? And I think that is in part why many African American leaders are going with Clinton's pragmatism. Not to mention the fact that of the two candidates, she is the most directly aligning herself with Obama. That's smart. I am his former Secretary of State and wearing that mantle. Most folks see what she's doing there, but they know it's smart as well.
Okay. Bernie Sanders has more prominently gotten Cornel West to stone for him and rapper out of Atlanta, Killer Mike.
Right.
Do you think those two individuals display the same values, or will African Americans voters in South Carolina identify with these two individuals?
I think that in some respects that Dr. West and Killer Mike and other popular figures and political experts and scholars will at least make African Americans take note. And particularly, I think young black people will take note. Because I think in some respects there is an inroad that Sanders could make. He has the challenge of being, an older white guy, in the 70s, and so that it's not sort of the young, fresh-faced image. Okay. But the idea that, why would a Cornel West endorse him? Or why would Killer Mike or other, hip hop or popular culture figures endorse this individual? It'll make folk take note. Now, the question is, will it actually mobilize and get folk out? Will it actually have folk think about, and another part we can talk about is certainly sort of the racial justice plank of the Sanders campaign. Those are those things that will draw folk, not just make them listen, but may actually have them consider coming out and voting and supporting the campaign. So it's getting publicity. I cannot say that that's going to translate into votes as of yet, particularly because there's always in every election, there's the get out the vote infrastructure that is important. And in the African-American community, traditional leaders like African-American ministers and churches, they don't dictate what folk do, but they certainly can help set a climate. They certainly can help lay the groundwork. And given it's a formidable institution among, other sort of civic and civic organizations or civic and social and religious organizations, it can make a critical difference in that regard.
Okay. Why we hear in the news that South Carolina's primary is very important in terms of national politics as well as Democratic politics. Well, South Carolina has very few electoral votes. Can you tell us why then is South Carolina such a critical primary state?
For Republicans, it's critical because South Carolina, unlike Iowa or New Hampshire, is really a bellwether sort of GOP state. And so even though South Carolina doesn't always predict the candidate who's going to win, the fact that you can say that in this deep southern state where the GOP is the dominant party that I want makes a difference. And particularly since someone like a Trump doesn't have the full blessing of the established leadership. And so for him to be able to say I won with the rank and file would make a critical difference. For a Democratic candidate like Sanders, it matters in that the African-American community makes up, and African-American voters make up such a large block of the Democratic Party in this state. But let's be real, African-American voters make up a large block of Democratic voters nationwide. And so South Carolina is sort of the first state where you have a test of whether or not the African-American community, a key partner in that coalition, is going to come out and who African-Americans support. So it matters for different reasons for each of the parties, but it is a bellwether state in that regard. It doesn't predict all the time, but it does say that this campaign is credible, it has legs, and we should pay more attention to it, or this campaign is going to fall further back in the pack.
Okay. Professor Shaw, before I let you go, in your personal opinion, what should the Sanders campaign be doing to really drive home their message and resonate with African Americans in South Carolina?
I think the Sanders campaign has to comfortably mesh its economic justice message with its racial justice message. Not long ago, a fairly prolific writer, Ta-Nehisi Coates, made as he does because he is a thinker and a writer, made a provocative statement about Sanders' campaign not supporting the notion of reparations. Now, not that there is a groundswell of American support for reparations, although African-American communities will talk about that issue as critically important for justice. But but what Coates sort of said, and what had got the debate going, was, well, now Sanders stands for all of these other radical planks, but then has stopped short of saying that reparations as a concept is something that his campaign would push. And so I think there is a way in which he still has to mesh parts of that economic justice message with the racial justice message comfortably. In an interesting way, I think actually Clinton does better in that regard than he does. I think in some way I don't want to say she's had more practice at it, and I'm not saying that she's any more genuine than he is. I just think that Sanders is so focused on the economic justice the economic justice message, that the racial justice message is critically important in Black and minority communities. I think in some ways he will admit that he's been pushed by activists such as the Black Lives Matter movement activists. You know, we had that event in Seattle. And he will say he's been constructively pushed. Again, I don't think it's a matter that Sanders believes it any less. I think he needs to find a way to frame it. If anyone asked what his key tagline would be, they would say, well, you know, the billionaires have had a long enough turn in running this country. Is now the time for the rest of us to get a fair shot. That's good. But what's the sort of racial or ethnic equality message that's the same snappy phrase? And I think that's what they really kind of need to drive that message home to African American voters.
Okay. Professor Shaw, thank you for taking time to sit down with me tonight.
Hey, it's been a great pleasure.